They say every small American town has a house you don't ask about, the one with curtains always drawn, where the air feels heavy even from the sidewalk. In the spring of 1978, in a faded mining town tucked deep into the Appalachian hills, that house belonged to a man named Richard Lorne. To strangers, he was polite, soft-spoken, the kind of man who fixed his own roof and never missed Sunday service. But inside those weather-worn walls, Richard kept a truth that would make even the town's most hardened old men lower their voices. Her name was Emily. She came into Richard's life when she was 9 years old, the daughter of the woman he married late in his life. Emily was not his blood, but in that small town, she may as well have been. The way families wove together there, everyone shared a little of everyone else. At first, the neighbors smiled when they saw him walking her to school, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. They thought he was being protective. They thought he was doing right by her. But time has a way of showing cracks in the picture frame. By the time Emily was 17, whispers began to rise like weeds. Richard had become her guardian, her provider, her closest confidant, and when her mother fell sick and died, the two of them stayed under the same roof, alone. People told themselves it was temporary, that she'd leave for college or for work in the city. But then the wedding invitations appeared. Cream-colored cards slipped into mailboxes, printed with words that didn't seem real. Richard Lorne was marrying his own stepdaughter. Some tore the invitation in half before even reading the date. Others stared at it for hours, trying to make sense of it. In a town where bloodlines were practically sacred, this was not just a scandal, it was an offense against something older than law. But the strangest thing wasn't that it happened. The strange thing was that no one stopped it. To this day, some say they can't remember the ceremony. They recall a white dress, the sound of rain against the tin roof of the church, the sight of Richard's hands, trembling, not with age, but with something else entirely. And somewhere in the back of every mind that sat in that church, there was the same unspoken question. Had this marriage really begun that day? Or years before, after the ceremony, the town pretended to return to normal. The hardware store still opened at 8. The same men still sat on the same stools at the diner, drinking coffee gone bitter from sitting too long. But when Richard and Emily walked past, the silence was sharper. Conversations broke like thin glass, and eyes that had been looking at storefronts or the street suddenly found the ground instead. It wasn't shame. It was something colder. The kind of stillness you see in a barn when a predator's shadow passes overhead. They moved into the same house they had shared before, but now the rooms felt different. The marriage license on the wall, framed next to the old family photographs, changed everything. Emily began wearing her hair differently, longer, tied back the way Richard liked. He bought her dresses she'd never have chosen herself. At first glance you might think it was the picture of domestic life, but there was no lightness in it. She rarely smiled in public, and when she did, it was the kind of smile that looks borrowed, like it didn't belong to her. Some of the older women in town whispered that it wasn't love that kept her there. It was inheritance. Richard had worked for the mines long enough to own his home outright, and he had a tidy sum hidden away in the bank. For a girl with no parents left, marrying him meant safety. Others said it was something worse, that when a bond is twisted early enough, the mind bends around it until it feels like truth. By the time you're old enough to see it for what it is, it's already too late to pull yourself free. There were rumors of visitors, people from neighboring towns who'd come to see the couple, as if they were some strange roadside attraction. They'd drive slowly past the house, sometimes even stopping, just to catch a glimpse through the lace curtains. Richard never seemed to mind. He stood tall, and he went into town greeting people as though nothing had changed, and maybe for him, nothing had. But in the dark hours of the night, neighbors swore they could hear Emily's voice through the open windows, not screaming, not crying, just speaking, low and steady, as if she was telling someone, or maybe herself, a story she didn't want to forget. By the summer of 1980, the marriage had settled into something that looked almost invisible to the outside world. The gossip faded, not because people forgot, but because they learned to swallow the discomfort. In small towns, silence is a currency. You keep someone else's secret today, so they'll keep yours tomorrow. And Richard, whether by charm or quiet threat, seemed to have bought himself more silence than most. Emily had changed in ways that were harder to name. She carried herself with a stillness, like someone holding their breath underwater. She didn't leave town often, and when she did, it was never alone. Richard was always beside her, at the grocery store, at church, even in the post office, where he would stand so close behind her, it looked like he was measuring the space she took up in the world. To the casual observer, it was protectiveness. To those who'd been paying attention, it was possession. One evening, a woman named Lorraine, one of Emily's mother's old friends, decided to stop by the house unannounced. She brought with her a small tin of biscuits, a polite excuse for what was really just curiosity. Lorraine would later say that the moment Emily opened the door, she felt as though she'd stepped into a place where time had stopped. The air smelled faintly of mothballs and something sweeter, almost cloying, like flowers left too long in water. Emily looked thinner. Her eyes darted toward the living room before she even said hello, as if checking whether she was allowed to speak. Richard appeared a moment later, his voice warm but his expression unreadable. He thanked Lorraine for the biscuits, placed them neatly on the counter, and stood in the doorway as she spoke to Emily. Not once did he sit down. Not once did he leave the room. When Lorraine left, she swore she could feel his eyes on her back until she reached her car. Around this time, people began to notice Emily was no longer attending certain church gatherings she once loved, the women's Bible study, the quilting circle, even Sunday potlucks. Richard claimed she'd grown tired of them, but some said they saw her at the window during these events, watching the street, her hands resting on the windowsill, like she was waiting for someone to walk up and knock, someone who never came. And beneath it all, there was an unspoken understanding in town. Whatever had drawn them together, it wasn't over. It had only grown quieter, deeper, and more dangerous. It was in the winter of 1982 when the first real fracture appeared. A snowstorm had swallowed the town whole, the kind that made even the main road disappear beneath a white, wind-smoothed sheet. For 3 days, no one left their homes unless they had to. On the fourth morning, the postman trudged through the snow to deliver what little mail had managed to get through. Among the envelopes and catalogues in Richard's box was a letter addressed to Emily. No return address. Neighbors later said they saw Richard take the letter inside without calling for her. Others claimed they saw him burn something in the wood stove that afternoon, standing over it like a priest at an altar. Emily, for her part, didn't leave the house for the next week. When she finally appeared at the corner store, her hands were bare despite the cold, the skin on her knuckles cracked and raw. She didn't speak much, just bought bread, milk, and a jar of honey, and left. The letter became the center of a new round of whispers. Some thought it was from family she hadn't seen since her mother died, maybe an aunt or a cousin. Others were convinced it was from someone who knew what had been going on before the wedding. Whatever it was, it seemed to shake something in Emily. She was seen more often staring out the upstairs window, her breath fogging the glass, her expression locked somewhere between hope and fear. By spring, Richard had built a new fence around the property, taller than the old one, solid boards, no gaps. It wasn't the kind of fence meant to keep people out. It was the kind meant to keep someone in, and the strange thing was, nobody asked him why. That's the way it works in towns like that. You notice, you wonder, but you don't ask. Then, in June, something happened that the town couldn't ignore. Emily showed up at church alone. She sat in the very back pew, her head bowed so low that most didn't even realize it was her until the service ended. And when she stood to leave, a deep purple bruise bloomed along her jawline. People looked, but no one said a word. Richard was waiting outside by the car. He opened the door for her, and she got in without meeting his eyes. The door shut, the car pulled away, and just like that, the quiet closed back in. Heavier than before, like snow that had been packed down by too many footsteps. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? By 1984, the story of Richard and Emily had faded into something like local folklore, the kind of tale new families heard in half-whispered warnings from their neighbors. But folklore has a way of holding on to its sharp edges, and this one was no exception. There were things people remembered that didn't make sense, moments that gnawed at them years later. One man, a former miner named Harold, recalled an afternoon when Richard came into the tavern, sober but somehow unsteady. He ordered one beer, took 2 slow sips, and began speaking about keeping what's yours, in a tone that felt less like advice and more like a threat to no one in particular. Harold said the way Richard's hands gripped the glass, white-knuckled, trembling, reminded him of men he'd known in the mines who'd been too long underground. Emily, meanwhile, had grown quieter. She rarely looked people in the eye anymore. Her clothes became plainer, as if she were trying to erase herself from sight, but there were moments, brief, almost invisible, when something broke through. Once, a schoolteacher swore she saw Emily smile at a group of children playing in the street, a real smile, light and unguarded. But as soon as Richard appeared, that smile vanished, replaced by a mask so practiced it might as well have been carved into her. Then came the night of the fire. No one knows how it started. Some say faulty wiring, others say a candle left burning. But just after midnight, smoke began to pour from the windows of the Lorne house. Neighbors rushed out into the street shouting, but by the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, the front half of the house was already swallowed in flames. Richard stood in the yard in nothing but his nightshirt, coughing into a handkerchief. Emily was nowhere to be seen. The fireman pulled her out from the back bedroom, unconscious but alive. Her hands were burned, and there was a deep gash on her temple. She was taken to the small county hospital and kept for 2 nights. During that time, no one saw Richard visit her. When she returned home, the fence was higher. A padlock now hung on the inside of the gate. The fire changed something in Emily, though it wasn't the kind of change you could see in daylight. People said she moved differently now, with a strange patience, like someone waiting for the right season to plant a seed. She began venturing into town more often, always with some small excuse, picking up flour, delivering a note, buying sewing thread. And each time she lingered just a little longer before returning home, as if memorizing the shape of the streets, the distance to certain doorways, the way the town looked from every possible angle. Richard seemed to sense it. His presence grew heavier, more watchful. He stood closer in public, spoke for her when shopkeepers asked questions, kept a hand on the small of her back when they walked. But in the way predators sometimes mistake stillness for submission, he didn't see that her silence had shifted. It was no longer the silence of someone trapped. It was the silence of someone counting down. Then came the day she went missing. It was late autumn, a Wednesday. Richard had been seen in town that morning buying tobacco and nails, his mood unremarkable. By evening he was at the sheriff's office, his voice sharp with panic. He claimed Emily hadn't come home from the market. The sheriff organized a search party, not because he believed Richard, but because in a town this small, you don't ignore a missing person. They combed the woods, the old rail yard, the empty mine shafts. Days passed with no sign of her. Richard grew restless, snapping at neighbors, demanding they look harder. But on the 7th day, she was found, not in the woods but 30 miles away, in a women's shelter across the state line. She had walked there, following back roads and creek beds to avoid being seen. When asked why, she said only one thing: "I couldn't live where the air belonged to him." The sheriff didn't press her for detail, as maybe because he didn't want to know. The law as it stood had no name for what Richard had done. She was of legal age when they married. She had no bruises when she left. And so, after a few tense weeks, Richard stopped coming into town altogether. His house, scorched from the fire and ringed with its high fence, became exactly what it had always been, the one you didn't ask about. Years later, when the house finally sold, the new owners found things that the town had long stopped imagining. In the attic, Beneath a layer of dust thick enough to swallow footprints, they discovered boxes filled with photographs. Most were of Emily, some taken at school events, some in the backyard, others candid and strange, with her caught mid-motion, mid-laugh, mid-breath. The earliest ones dated back to when she was 12. There were letters, too, dozens of them never sent, some in Emily's handwriting, shaky and uneven, speaking of loneliness, confusion, and the feeling of being watched even when she was alone. Others were in Richard's hand, written to her as if she were far away, but she had been living under his roof the entire time. In one he wrote, "You were mine before you knew it. You'll be mine after you forget it." The new owners turned the boxes over to the sheriff, but by then Richard was an old man living in a trailer on the edge of town. When questioned, he denied everything. He said the photos were innocent, the letters part of private marital correspondence, nothing more. There were no charges. There never had been. Emily never returned. Some say she moved west, remarried, had children. Others believe she kept to herself, never quite letting anyone get close enough to take something from her again. And in the end, maybe that was the truest wound Richard left behind. Not the years she lost, but the walls she would spend the rest of her life keeping up. Even now, in that small Appalachian town, there's a weight to her story that can't be shaken. Children grow up hearing only fragments. Teenagers dare each other to walk past the old Lorne property at night, and the older folks, they just shake their heads. They know what it means when a secret like that is allowed to grow in plain sight. They know it doesn't disappear when the house changes hands. Because some truths aren't buried in the ground, they're carried in the people who survive them. And if you've heard this story to the end, you've opened a door most never dare touch. The door to a part of American family history that still lives in the dark, waiting for someone to notice the curtain move.